Hi, good afternoon. Um, that's really a very difficult act to follow, Dr. Griffin. Um, my comments are going to be focused on China and space. But just to build off of what NASA former Director Griffin had to say, one of the fundamental advantages that China does have is long-term vision and programmatic stability. I didn't get to hear all of his comments, but basically, one of the things that the Chinese have a huge advantage in is that they have top leadership support for their space program. Their top leadership, unlike ours, obviously, is very much knows that it will be in power for typically 10 years, although in the case of Xi Jinping, current leader, it may well last far longer than that. And as a result, there is long-term programmatic stability. When the Chinese leadership says we're going to do X, it doesn't change every 2, 4, or 8 years. And the funding that is associated with that will be stable. And so something to think about as we go over how does China think about space broadly. The thing to keep in mind is what the Chinese term comprehensive national power. And this is how the Chinese think about how nations rack and stack compared with each other. How do you compare a Brazil, a China, a Japan, a United States? What factors matter? And the Chinese are pretty upfront about what matters. Military power, absolutely. You can't defend yourself, you're really irrelevant. But military power by itself is insufficient. The Chinese have been very careful students of other people's history as well as their own. They saw what happened to the Soviet Union. So the collapse of the USSR showed that military power by itself was not enough. So economic power, very, very important. If military power is quote unquote actual power, then from a physics perspective, economic power is potential power. But it also generates the resources for building military capability. Diplomatic respect, other countries care what you think. Political unity. The Chinese Communist Party is the only political authority in China. It is able to guide the nation in the classic Leninist vanguard party sense. It sets policy direction, and the nation moves forward more or less altogether. Cultural security. Do other people, as opposed to countries, look up? Science and technology, a key part of economic power, because you want other people to, you don't simply want to make other people's washing machines and t-shirts, you want other people to use your operating system. You want to set the agenda. Space, from the Chinese view, touches every part of comprehensive national power. From an economic perspective, the Chinese emphasize that space is a potential breeding ground for key areas of both technology and future economic growth. They describe space as very dense in high technology. So a typical space mission, whether it is manned or unmanned, will involve advanced materials, power, energy storage, batteries, power generation, solar panels, information and communications technology, precision manufacturing, systems engineering, systems integration. So space, from the Chinese view, basically can serve as a locomotive to pull the rest of the economy forward. At a human level, having a strong space program inspires people to go into engineering and STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics. This to the Chinese is very important because the days of when the Chinese could say to the entire country, okay, you college graduates, this is where you're going to work, or you high school graduates, we're going to assign you to what majors you're going to go into. Those days are long gone. They ended in the 1980s. So today, people choose what college majors they will major in and where they go to work. So as a result, we can actually watch the Chinese advertise for aerospace engineers and electrical engineers and chemical engineers and various other engineers, also for insurance clerks and the rest. And so having a vibrant space program, in particular, a manned space program, is for the Chinese an important part of recruitment for the ranks of the future spacecraft designers, rocket engineers, etc. And in fact, what's really interesting is when we look at Chinese documentation about the history of their manned space program, Project 921, we see them having massive debates about what shape this would take. This was in the late 1980s, early 1990s. But one of the things that came through, and this was from the PLA, the Liberation Army, but also other top engineers, was we need to have a manned space program to inspire young people to become aerospace engineers. That's a very interesting insight on the Chinese side. They are thinking long-term, because think about that, right? In the 1980s and 1990s, when China was nowhere near as economically or scientifically as capable as it is today, they're already saying, what do we need to do to lay the foundations for future capability? The Chinese also see, therefore, space as not only directly pulling the economy along, but creating expertise in other areas, in particular systems integration and systems engineering. So the Chinese have two major state-owned enterprises that dominate their space industrial complex. And one of the things that has happened has been moving some of the top leaders out of places like CAS, the China Aerospace Science and Technology Corporation, over to COMAC, Commercial Airline Corporation of China, the people who are trying to design their competition for the 747 and the 777. And it's interesting that they are coming out of places like CAS because the idea is, hey, you've done a lot of systems integration. You've done a lot of systems engineering when you were designing spacecraft and launch vehicles and figuring out how they would mate, et cetera. So you can presumably figure out how to make an airline with all of its various subsystems and figure out how to make them work all together. Space also plays a role in politics, both domestic and foreign. In terms of domestic politics, a huge piece of China's space program is building the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party. Basically, the CCP is very proud to point to China's various space accomplishments. Again, whether it involves manned missions or unmanned missions, whether it is China's Beidou position navigation and timing capability, or whether it is its lunar mission, lunar exploration missions, now the Mars mission, China's communication satellites, to say, we did this. We, the CCP, have moved China from 1949, when 80% of the population was illiterate, when China didn't even manufacture its own car and no airplanes, to a China that is one of a handful of nations that can put people into space. One of only 3 nations that has its own satellite navigation system, etc. So this is partly domestic legitimacy. It is also space applications in the service of national unity. The Chinese emphasize things like direct TV, not in order to beam Game of Thrones out to the countryside, although that doesn't happen, but interestingly, one, to beam national level television programming, including the news, but also stories about courageous CCP heroes or soap operas about the Chinese Civil War, or telemedicine out to the countryside, places where normal television broadcasting would be difficult. And the point of this is to say, look at what we are doing to bring the country together, to really leverage all of these capabilities. In terms of foreign politics, the Chinese space program, one, serves the purpose of deterrence. It's signaling places like Taiwan, but also the United States, Russia, India. We have a strong space capability. We have the ability to see you forming your forces if that were an issue. But also, there is a very important soft side. We see this with Fengring cast. Fengring is the Chinese weather satellite constellation. The Chinese have given away the ability to download weather data directly from Fengring satellites. It's not very extensive. It's a couple of essentially PCs. and a satellite dish that you probably put in your backyard. But the point is to say, we will provide this for free to other countries. China has helped create things like the Asia-Pacific Space Cooperation Organization, which brings together major space powers like Bangladesh, Thailand, and Outer Mongolia, but also Iran. The idea here, again, is to say we, China, are different from the United States, from Russia, from Europe. We cooperate with small countries. We want to work together with you in space, about space. The other aspect of foreign policy is that it ties into things like Belt and Road Initiative. The Chinese have openly talked about creating something like the Space Silk Road. And that term actually has multiple different meanings. One is simply the use of Beidou to plot out where you're going to build infrastructure. Another definition, however, that the Chinese themselves refer to is the linking together of Beidou, position, navigation, timing satellites, with Earth observation satellites and weather satellites to create an information corridor that all states that sign onto the Space Silk Road would be able to access and exploit. And that, in turn, has, it ties BRI recipients to China in what can be interpreted as very positive. Something to think about here, however, and this specifically refers to Beidou, is that when China builds terrestrial infrastructure for BRI, pipeline, power grids, cell phone networks, there is a huge timing component to all of this. The pumps on 1,000 miles of pipeline have to be synchronized so that they don't pump all at the same time. You actually want to have them asynchronous because you don't want to create back pressure waves in the pipeline. That's best achieved with the satellite towers. Cell phone towers need to basically be able to coordinate their shifting function, timing systems. Power grids often employ timing systems. What all of this does is tie this physical infrastructure to China. And what that also means is that should a country like Kyrgyzstan or Kazakhstan or Azerbaijan or Greece someday choose not to want to work with China, they're going to have a really tough time of it because so much of their infrastructure will be tied to a Chinese timing signal. And there is nothing in those contracts that says that China is obligated to help you move to somebody else's timing signal. And then, of course, there's the military. And there we see the Chinese pursuing all sorts of interesting programs. In 2007, they did the ASAT test. I'm sure I don't have to talk to you folks much about that. Worst debris generating event in recent history. But where space plays a larger role is that the Chinese see space not as important for space's own sake. It's not about preserving space. It's about the information that transits over. And in this regard, there is an asymmetric value to space between the United States and China. China's military contingencies, for the most part, are still nearby. Taiwan above all else. Well, Taiwan's 100 miles away from the Chinese mainland. So you can do reconnaissance on China, on Taiwan, from China, with aircraft, with UAVs, fishing boats, submarines. You have radar that will cover the Taiwan airspace. You can communicate among your forces using cell phones, radios, telephone, fiber optic, laser line of sight. You don't need satellites to watch China, coordinate your forces, or even necessarily to guide your weapons, because you can probably map it all out fairly accurately. And there are enough Chinese tourists to go out there with Beidou or GPS handset to give you a pretty good sense of where things are. We, the US, fight away games. We are going over there. Over there may be the Baltic, over there may be the Western Pacific, but it is so far away that we have to rely on satellites for reconnaissance, for communication, for timing, for all of the things that the Chinese don't. So the Chinese understand that in the event of a military confrontation, then, information that comes by way of space is absolutely essential for the US and is nice to have, but nowhere near as essential for China. So in theory, if you were to eliminate all space assets from the order of battle of the two sides, China would say, yeah, that's an inconvenience, kind of, maybe, but we can probably get by with that. For the US, it would leave us out of Schlitz. Imagine trying to coordinate multiple carrier group operations. Imagine trying to communicate between various carrier airlines. Imagine trying to coordinate between submarines and surface forces or air forces or ground forces without the ability to rely upon satellite communication. Imagine what happens to your timing signals for your frequency hopping radios. All of these sorts of things will be left by the wayside. So for all of these reasons of comprehensive national power, China emphasizes space. China's space program has always enjoyed high-level support, highest level support. Mao Zedong, back in the 1950s, said, well, if other countries are going to do space, we need to do space also. It's not an accident that China's highest leaders, Jiang Zemin, Deng Xiaoping, Jiang Zemin, Hu Jintao, and now Xi Jinping, all go to space events in a way that really we haven't probably been as consistent about since Apollo. Let me close with just a couple of interesting things that the Chinese are pursuing in space. Of course, this past summer, they launched Tianwen-1, China's first interplanetary probe that was successfully launched. China did put a probe on with the Russians in the Phobos-Grunt joint mission to Mars. That one failed because of the Russian launch vehicle failing to obtain the right orbit here in order to go on to Mars and eventually deorbit to its destruction. So the Chinese basically are on their way out there. We assume it will land somewhere around April 2021. We think in the Utopia Phoenicia region. I guess they're going to get a jump on renting out to Starfleet for the shipyards there. And it will include both a rover as well as a lander. This past couple, about a week ago, the Chinese launched Gaofen 13. This is a geosynchronous Chinese Earth observation satellite. It's part of a broader explicit Chinese effort to build an all-weather, constant 24/7 Earth observation network. Gaofen means high resolution. So really what this is about, although the Chinese won't admit this, is a military observation network to keep tabs on foreign militaries, among other things. Tianwen-1 and the impending Chang'e 5 were both delayed, potentially. Definitely the Chang'e 5 and the Chinese space station because of problems with the Long March 5. Long March 5 is China's new heavy lift booster. It's roughly in the Ariane 5 Delta IV Heavy range. Multiple failures initially. They've spent the last several years getting the kinks worked out. It appears to have been partly a manufacturing problem, possibly also engine problem. They went directly, once they thought they fixed it, to actually launching actual payloads as opposed to test payloads. What is interesting, however, about Long March 5B is that it apparently goes up with its engines rather than in a stage that drops out at high altitude. And so it goes into low Earth orbit with the engines before deorbit. And in the case of at least one of the recent launches, the engines, large hunks of metal that they are, wound up in the Ivory Coast on land, suggesting that the Chinese are somewhat negligent with regards to downrange impact and don't seem to be particularly concerned about the potential consequences of such an act. So let me conclude there and open up to Q&A.
I'll ask one while you're getting your audio fixed. Besides China and America, what nations or organizations do you think are most poised to achieve human colonization of space?
Well, we, the Chinese and the Russians, are the only ones that currently have the ability to put people into space. We obviously have SpaceX, and eventually ULA's entrance, SLS, will presumably work. So we'll have two competing systems able to do that. I mean, it's interesting to consider here that Europe, which has a substantial space capability, has not chosen to develop human-rated space launch. Japan, as far as we know, does not seem to have a interest in developing its own human-rated vehicles. The Indians may choose to go down that path, but at the end of the day, India has, frankly, more limited resources than the US, China, or even Russia. Now, what is interesting here is that that doesn't necessarily mean that other countries won't send people to go into space in partnership with us, the Chinese, with the Russians. The Chinese have openly said that they are prepared to train foreign astronauts at their astronaut training facility. Personally, it would not surprise me if after the Chinese space station goes operational with the Chinese, that fairly early on, they would take a foreign astronaut up. One, it would most likely be from the APSCO membership. My unsuspicion is that it would most likely be Pakistani to underscore the strategic level relationship between China and Pakistan. The Russians, of course, have indicated a willingness to sell seats aboard spacecraft up to the ISS to the highest bidder. They definitely need hard currency. At this point, frankly, I don't see the Europeans being willing to commit the kind of funds necessary to develop a human-rated space launch. And for everybody else, South Korea, Japan, that's a lot of money that it's not clear they're prepared to spend at this time. That may change once somebody establishes a long-term presence on the moon and demonstrates a financial return on investment.
All right, let's go ahead with another question. How do you think China will manage having independent space colonies based on them? Will they still be Chinese, or will they be their own countries like US, Canada, or Mexico?
I'm assuming lunar or anywhere. So let's start with lunar colonies. First off, I think that it's important to note here that at this point in time, we don't actually have a good sense of when China is planning on sending people to the moon. In Dean Cheng's opinion, I think it is, I would say with some degree of confidence, that the Chinese will do so eventually. But here, the Chinese give us some indications because their major programs, Long March 5, space station, this new constellation of Earth observation satellites, these are all tied to 5-year plans. That's part of why the Chinese have programmatic stability. They think in terms of 5-year plans. Big projects like human spaceflight, maybe multiple 5-year plans. But the point is that they don't do either add-ons or subtractions from 5-year plans. So here in 2020, we're at the end of a 5-year plan. We have the next 5-year plan pretty much already published, already written up. I believe that they're announcing it actually next week. Is going to be the 5-year plan for 2021 to 2025. There's no indication at this time that there is a crewed mission plan for the moon. Plus, we see no evidence at this time of the testing typically associated with a crewed mission, soft landings. So remember, they've only landed once. So that would suggest that the earliest that they would probably be able to do this would be 2026 to 2030. And more likely the next 5-year plan. So under those circumstances, the Chinese are most likely going to send a handful of people to the moon for a lunar mission. It may be intended to be long-term, probably not permanent. So we'd be talking about a very, very long-term plan before you would have anything like a self-sustaining Chinese colony. And that will be Chinese. It will not be a lunar nation or something like that. As for cooperation with other lunar colonies, certainly possible. But again, looking at how China behaves on Earth, any colony they establish on the moon or elsewhere is going to be Chinese first. And by the way, there are always Chinese political officers and political CCP members, as the Chinese put it. Wherever there are 3 Chinese people, 1 should be a party member. So unless the party is blessing some kind of independence or autonomy movement, which is highly unlikely, there will be CCP people keeping tabs on all the other colonists.
Awesome. One more question. In the same way as China's doctrine in the South China Sea is to claim a foothold, will they apply the same philosophy to lunar bases and orbital bases?
That's a great question. The honest answer is obviously we don't know. They haven't yet established anything like these. What is interesting and something to think about here is that we, the US, have talked about keep-out zones for satellites from a health and safety perspective. You probably don't want something that is not tightly under control and being monitored approaching a communication satellite closer than, let's say, 5 miles, and certainly, or 20 miles, right? Well, what's the difference between that and sovereignty? In theory, given how the Chinese have behaved in the South China Sea, they make artificial islands and then start ascribing to those artificial islands, artificial, keyword, all of the claims that are typically associated with natural islands, territorial waters, exclusive economic zones. It would not be surprising if the Chinese were to claim a comparable keep-out zone for a satellite for health and safety reasons, and the same would probably also apply for a moon base or a Mars base or something else. Now, where this becomes potentially really problematic is what if you start daisy chaining? So in orbit, there is no sovereignty. Everyone agrees on that. But if I started daisy chaining, let's say at 20-mile radius, a series of satellites, and everyone has a 20-mile radius, keep-out zone for health and safety reasons, what happens? We're not declaring sovereignty. We're just saying, hey, for health and safety reasons, please keep out. You see where this could go. So this is one of the reasons why I personally am always deeply troubled by codes of conduct and all these other things about space, because we sort of assume everybody has the same understanding, the same approach, the same interpretation of terms, concepts, and that's just not true. And we see this in the South China Sea. We see this with intellectual property. I'm not sure why we think space, which the Chinese see as vital and strategic, would be a zone where they would just automatically say, oh, well, we'll take the American understanding of how this works.
1 minute.
And one last question would be, how do we encourage China to take more responsible actions in space, given actions like the CZ-5B first stage and the Tiangong-2 uncontrolled deorbitings?
What makes you think they're irresponsible? That would be the Chinese. The Chinese don't take well to the accusation that somehow they're being irresponsible, etc. To their mind, they are doing what they are going to do. And one of the sillier terms I've often heard is, well, we can name and shame. I'm sorry, you do not have the ability to shame China. Oh, but what about face? Face is a very, very complex, complicated topic. There are entire volumes on the psychology of the Chinese. This is not at the individual, this is about sociology and societal construct that brings home just how complex the entire concept of face is. To waltz in and say, well, we'll just name and shame, and then they'll understand. They understand perfectly well. They read English way more than Americans read Chinese. So how do you get them to behave the way you want them to? Carrots and sticks. They've had a lot of carrots. The problem is nobody's really been willing to apply sticks. Right after the 2007 ASAT test, the head of the European Space Agency pretty much immediately announced that they were looking forward to cooperating with China in future manned space missions. Even now, with all that's been going on with IP and other things, ESA goes out there and says, we really, really want to cooperate with China. And maybe ESA will send astronauts up to the Chinese space station if China will have them. that's not a message conducive to dissuading Beijing that its behavior is improper. That says to China, I'm the big dog, and you're going to accept whatever it is I do. If I pee on your leg, you'll accept that it's raining.